Old Testament reading is from Psalm 50, verses 1 through 6. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes and does not keep silent. Before him is a devouring fire and a mighty tempest all around him. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare his righteousness, for God himself is judge. Our gospel reading is from Mark chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling bright, such as no one on earth could brighten them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. The word of God for all people. Amen.
Thank you, Heather. If you have ever stood in a moment of transition in your own life, you understand the anxiety of wondering, what happens next? In the last days of one job before you start a new one, sitting in your long-time home as you pack the last box before you move to a new house, the final exam before you graduate and venture into the world, or even the final moments with a loved one. Each transition holds great mystery. What happens next? Every year on this last Sunday of Epiphany, as we steel ourselves for the long and sometimes somber journey we call Lent, we remember the glorious transfiguration of Jesus. Marianne Borg, a retired Episcopal priest and the spouse of the late theologian Marcus Borg, writes, "This story is the beginning frame for the season of Lent. And," she says, "in brilliant storytelling fashion, it gives us a glimmer of what is to come." So before we head into the desert for Lent, let's embrace the glimmer. Let's wonder together what happens next on this day of transition. Peter, James, and John have known Jesus as their friend who walks with them and leads them in incredible ministry, unbelievable moments together. They have witnessed amazing things, from his miracles to his divine wisdom, but none of it compares to this moment on the mountain. Jesus changed right in front of their eyes. His clothes became dazzling. It was astounding, I am sure. Many years ago, when attempting to teach this story to kids in this church, I had them act it out very dramatically. One of the kids pretended to be Jesus, and in the absence of a dazzling robe, he gave us a rousing performance with jazz hands. And the others were all the disciples, and they dropped their jaws in pretend amazement and shielded their eyes from the glare of the light, the glare of the jazz hands. And it was an Oscar-winning performance all around. After their reenactment, I asked the kids how they thought Jesus' clothes became so sparkly. I was hoping, of course, their answers would match the drama of the moment. I waited for their revelation, like the dun, 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 it was God, or dun, 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 Jesus is God. I did not get that answer. These were tweens. So what I got was a few boys in the corner of the room, and if I remember correctly, it was Owen Welling, Daniel Dewey, and Brandon Hudepole, who are all now seniors in high school, which is mind-blowing. All three of them yelled simultaneously, It was Tide Pods. And that's when I decided, let's skip the theatrics and go back to the actual Bible text. So I reread verse 3. His clothes became dazzling bright, such as no one on earth could brighten them. No one on earth, not even Procter & Gamble. But I will admit, it would make a heck of a Super Bowl ad if they could make that claim. This story is significant because it's the first moment when the disciples experienced Jesus as a heavenly being rather than merely an earthly one. I'm not suggesting the Son of God was above doing his own laundry. I'm just saying it's not what made his clothes razzle dazzle. Now, a quick aside, if you are familiar with the musical Chicago, you might be humming a tune right now. Razzle Dazzle is one of the most recognizable songs from that show. In that number, the character Billy Flynn teaches Roxy Hart how to lie in court. Essentially, he encourages her to use over-the-top charisma and phony emotions to gain the trust of the judge and jury. In the dance number, we see Roxy go from her modest attire to flashy sequins, and she is clearly uncomfortable in a look not her own. In other words, Billy Flynn suggests, don't let them see you for you. Jesus' dazzling moment is the antithesis of that, though. It is not phony. It's what I call a holy razzle-dazzle. The brightness of his clothing here is pivotal, revealing his genuine godliness. Mark describes Jesus' clothing elsewhere in his gospel account, each time with great significance. In chapter 5, for example, a woman desperate for healing reached out to touch the hem of his garment, and it was the fringe of his prayer shawl that she touched, a very traditional garment for Jewish men. Several weeks from now, from this same gospel account, we will hear about soldiers covering Jesus in a purple cloth after his arrest, just to take it away from him and give him his own clothes shortly before they crucify him. Those clothes will eventually be stripped from his body and divided among the soldiers responsible for his death. Mark describes each of these garments in a way that signifies the human world, one often consumed by illness and the actions of those who willingly bring harm. The dazzling bright clothes are described as a stark contrast to those other garments. Jesus is not of this world. And yet he was in this world. Here he stands at the threshold of his life and his ministry and his forthcoming death and resurrection. In this moment, we encounter Jesus in his own transition. If the brightness of his robe wasn't enough to help them understand this, the company of their faith ancestors, Elijah and Moses, would force the disciples to understand the gravity of the moment. Peter's best efforts to get them to stay by building them tents, well, those efforts are in vain. Elijah and Moses appear only for a moment. And as Marianne Borg suggests, this is a glimmer of what is to come for Jesus also. The transfiguration of Jesus prepares the disciples that he will not remain with them for long. Interestingly, the same word that means transfiguration in Greek is also translated as meaning metamorphosis. When we think about metamorphosis, we think about caterpillars transforming into butterflies. Elementary school children often get to watch this amazing process when teachers bring the wonder of nature into their classrooms. When kids talk about observing metamorphosis in school, two things always strike me. First, their various pronunciations of the word metamorphosis. And second, the names they choose for their little critters. It seems like kids are always naming the caterpillars. My favorite was when a child told me once that her caterpillar's name was just Bob. To which I responded, "You named him Bob, well that's nice." And she said, "No, his full name is just Bob." I learned a long time ago that when a child tells you the name of their pet, be it a critter or something furry, you just don't ask questions. So for weeks, the children will watch just Bob, for example, eat leaves and then spin his cocoon. Eventually, after much anticipation and under the watchful eye of many children, he will break out of his small, sophisticated structure with new, vibrantly painted wings. And that's when the children go outside and watch just Bob fly away. Here's the thing about metamorphosis. The creature's appearance has changed, but his essence is still the same. It is still just Bob. Jesus' metamorphosis did not make him into something or someone he hasn't been all along. It's the moment he finally reveals himself fully to these 3 disciples. Why didn't he allow people to see him like this all along? Wouldn't that have made it easier for him to attract a larger following? Peter, James, and John were unique in their closeness with Jesus. I mentioned earlier that they had been with him through a lot, and by that I mean they had been with him in extraordinary times. James and John were with Peter when Jesus healed his mother-in-law. They were the only 3 disciples to witness Jesus resurrect a little girl in Mark chapter 5. They are the only 3 Jesus invites up this mountain witnessing his transfiguration, and ultimately they will be the only 3 who Jesus invites to join him in the Garden of Gethsemane in his final hours. We don't know why Jesus chose to call especially close relationships with these 3 disciples in particular, but we do know that Jesus stands with these 3 men in some of the most extraordinary moments of his life. There is no way a relationship like this with Jesus could leave these men unchanged. So yes, this story about the transfiguration of Jesus is indeed about Jesus, but it is also about the transfiguration of the disciples. Their essence was still the same, like just Bob, but their journey with him had clearly transformed them. That journey was necessary to prepare them for, to open them up to this specific moment, so they could see him for who he really is. Not one of these men was without flaws. James and John would shamelessly try to wrangle spots of honor on Jesus' throne just a few chapters from now. Peter, well, we will talk about Peter during Lent, but it is fair to say that he is inconsistent in his devotion to Jesus. Yet, Jesus chose to entrust these men with his identity. When Peter, James, and John stood in cascading beams that shone from Jesus, they realized not only was he truly the light of the world, but they were worthy of standing in his light. He had invited them into it. Never once has the question of discipleship been about how perfect we are. It has always been about how willing we are to walk with Jesus, even when he invites us into the most difficult or astounding moments. For that is when we see him for who he really is. The good news of the Transfiguration story today is revealed to us in both this gospel lesson and also in our psalm. Let me read again the first part of Psalm 50. The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. From the rising of the sun to its setting. In that sweeping transition from day to night, when we encounter every kind of challenge in our lives, God shines forth. In the biggest, scariest moments of their lives, when the disciples must have been wondering, what happens next? God's light shined forth. Even when that light, Jesus' godliness, wasn't obvious, he was always the same. As we wait at this threshold between Epiphany and Lent, ready to ponder our own frailty, and as some of us stand in seasons of murky transition in our own lives, let us trust that Jesus invites us, our flaws and all, to stand in his glimmering, razzle-dazzle light. May his glories strengthen and comfort us when we don't know the answer to